Go to the book of Proverbs, chapter 19. We'll go back to the book of Proverbs, chapter 19. We'll pick up at verse 18, is where we left off last time. Verse 18 says, "Chasten thy son while there is hope, and let not thy soul spare for his crying." The old ASV, or American Standard Version of 1901, changed this to say, "Seeing there is hope." Chasten him, seeing there is hope, which doesn't seem to me to mean anything. Destroys the sense and the teaching of the proverb. And the verse is plain, and it means what it's obviously saying, what it's obviously teaching, that you're to whip him no matter how much he screams, no matter how much he cries, while there is still some hope for him. While there is a chance of reforming his bad behavior, you're to spank him. The Bible's word is whip, or to chasten. The rod of correction, or rather, as they used to say, the board of correction needs to be applied to the seat of learning. We used to have, when I talk about the way times have changed when we were kids here, we used to have a wooden paddle hanging up on the back by the entrance of the church. I mean, I got my share of it when I was growing up here. My brother did too. I don't know if my sister ever got it, but talk about a church as providing all the essentials for the family. Those are the things, parenting tools, things that they need to raise their kids right. It was hanging up on the wall, and it was the funniest little thing because it said for ages 5 to 75. And on the paddle, I don't know. Do you guys have that somewhere in storage? Pastor Kim may have it in his office. That paddle is older than I am. I'm going to be 51 years old in a couple weeks. So that paddle's an antique. But on the front of the paddle, it had a sort of the drawing of a guy bending over, grabbing his, because he was going to get it. And I got my share of it when I was growing up, and we'd be sitting there in the middle of church, or in the middle of the service on the front row. My mom would sit on the second row, and I'd have to sit in front of her so she could keep an eye on me so I would behave. And I know at least once, but I'm thinking it might have been even twice, when I was growing up, I'd be fooling around with one of my friends from Sunday school during church, and right in the middle of my dad's sermon, right in the middle of his preaching, he'd walk right down off the step and walk right down to me, lean down and say, "No, you're going to behave, right? The rest of the time? You know what's going to happen if you don't." Dun, dun, dun. That's all it took. I sat up straight. I was scared to death. I'm going to get it when I get home. But and I remember doing it one time with my own kids. We were up in Lytle Creek. Elizabeth remembers. And right in the middle of my sermon, I walked away from the pulpit. I walked down right where they were sitting, fooling around. And I, very hushed tones, let them know that was going to stop, right? And, boy, it did. And it didn't take any more than that, thank the Lord. But chasten thy son while there is hope, and let not thy soul spare for his crying. You whip him before he's big enough to whip you. He'll be too big to whip you one day. Then all hope will be gone. And Daniel and I had a good one time. I won't go into details, but he was much bigger. He's already been much bigger than me since he was about 15. And so this was had to take a different tack. We weren't able to just, you don't bend them over and spank them or something. No. It was much more aggressive and, WWE, the World Wrestling Federation. Well, it was sort of like that. There's a German proverb that says, "Better the son should cry than the father." Years later. Someone says, "Let him cry. It'll help develop his lung capacity." And our ancient adage, or folk adage in America, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." And it's unfortunate that in this modern wussy, feel-good, sensitive world, parents think time out is a really strict way of getting to the kid, getting the point across. It wasn't like that when we were growing up. I mean, and I'm sure in the world wasn't going to raise our kids that way. You can have time out after I lay into you. Take all the time you need to cry. But that's time out. That's nonsense. Life is too short to sit and wait for the kid to decide he wants to cooperate. Instead of have to hasten it with a little help. A child who will not obey at 4 will never obey at 40. The Bible says, whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. Hebrews 12:6. A tree grows by the way the twig is bent when it's young. And if you start, over there in Pomona, there's on Indian Hill, right about near Indian Hill and Kingsley, there's a palm tree. In fact, your dad's got one sort of like it in his jungle there, at his house. That grows sideways. Did he bend it that way when it was young? But there's this palm tree in a front yard, and the length of it probably 60 feet at least. But it goes up, 8-9 feet, and then it curves down and goes across the yard, almost touches the ground, and then about way over here, 15 feet over here, it goes back up again. It's the weirdest shaped thing in the middle of this person's yard, but I'm wondering if years ago someone didn't try to bend it that way and make it go the way they wanted it to go. To me, it's an eyesore. Why would you want to obstruct your front lawn with this snaking pine tree, or palm tree rather? But it's there, and but a tree will bend and grow the direction you bend it or force it to when it's small. Look at verse 20 in our text. Hear counsel and receive instruction, that thou mayest be wise in thy latter end. It's a very practical book, the book of Proverbs. And the son who considers his latter end is going to receive instruction, and when his father dispenses it, and the dad should not hesitate to do that. Look at verse 27 also. Cease, my son, to hear the instruction that causeth to err from the words of knowledge. And that, how many people have made that mistake? The example right in front of us in the book of Proverbs, Solomon, who wrote this book, wrote it to his son, to instruct his son, and the most immediate son to receive this book was Rehoboam. Rehoboam succeeded King Solomon in the throne after Solomon was dead. And Rehoboam was a young man who was now seated upon the throne of Israel, and the people of the nation came to him and they said, your father made our burden grievous and heavy. They asked that he might lighten their burden. In other words, the taxation and the offerings that they required to build the temple, to build the king's palace, to build the city, etc. And they asked that he might lighten their burden. And he said, come back in 3 days and I'll give you an answer. And then he asked, so they left, and he asked the young men that were grown up in the kingdom with him, the same age, his contemporaries, as we'd say. And he said, what answer do you think I should give them? They say, no, you let them know who's in charge. You're the king now. You let them know your burden. Your father chastised you with whips. I'm going to chastise you with scorpions. You let them know that you're the king now, and nobody tells you what to do. And that's essentially the answer he gave when these people came back 3 days later, and he gave them that response. I'm going to tax you even heavier. And you know what that did? That caused the hearts of 10 of the 12 tribes to turn away from the household of King David and his descendants. And so the tribe of Judah, from which the king came, David and then Solomon, now Rehoboam, and the tribe of Benjamin, the only two tribes in the southern part of the land that stayed together. The other 10 tribes became a separate kingdom of Israel to the north. And you read through the books of Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings, you see these two lines of kings. In the reign of so-and-so, king of Judah, or king of Israel began so-and-so to reign in Judah, or vice versa. And two lines of kings are being described there in the books of Chronicles and Kings. Because Rehoboam's sin, his foolishness, and not consider... Listen, I mean, here, talk about a guy who had the whole book of Proverbs written to him alone, written to him specifically, and still turned a deaf ear to it. And he ended up fulfilling a lot of the scripture that his father warned him about. Earlier, like I said earlier in the book of Proverbs, the first 6, 7 chapters, Solomon is describing wisdom as a very beautiful, virtuous, lovely woman. And he's describing wisdom and understanding and knowledge of God and obedience to God to be the thing every person should seek after. And he's describing it as the kind of beautiful woman you want to take home to mama, the kind you're not ashamed to make your wife, the kind you're not afraid to be seen with, the one that you know loves you and you can love her and never have the fear of jealousy or envy or suspicion about what they're going to do or betray you. That is how he describes the wisdom of God. And then he describes foolishness like a streetwalker, the strange woman that flattereth with her lips. He talks about the guy, the young man he saw on the street going down to her neighborhood after dark to commit sin. And he talks about foolishness and rebellion and disobedience against God like a streetwalking whore. You don't want to take that girl home to mama. You don't even want anyone to know you've seen a woman like that. And so he's drawing this picture because he knows that's going to appeal to his son's flesh. This is kind of things that, Nathan, after David caused the death of Bathsheba's husband. So, Uriah the Hittite. I had a mental block there. After he caused his death on the battlefield, he had committed adultery with Bathsheba. She conceives and has a son that dies. God sent Nathan the prophet to speak to King David. And he says he figured out how to appeal to David about this matter. He said, there was a man traveling. He said, there's a man that had a great wealth of flocks and herds. And down the road there was a guy who had one little lamb in his household. In fact, it's like that family pet that grew up with his children. Well, the rich man had a guy visiting his home, a traveling man. And instead of making a feast from one of his own, he went down and stole the lamb, the one lamb that guy had, and offered it as the dinner for his friend. And David says, that man, his house should be knocked down and judged harshly and so forth and so on. And then Nathan says, thou art the man. You see, David had grown up as a shepherd, tending his father's sheep. And he could identify with the affection that people have for animals. I don't mean that in a sicko way, but you know what I mean. Everyone has a dog or a cat or a pet, some animal, a horse or whatever that they love, much as they love their own selves. And the loss of that pet is devastating. And so David can empathize with that. That man, should be judged harshly, his house torn down, etc. And then Nathan said, you're the man. You got all these wives. That's not enough. You go take the one guy's wife away from him and cause his death, etc. And so Nathan knew how to paint a picture, a visual picture in the mind of David that would garner a response, evoke a real response and a reaction from David. And likewise, Solomon's trying to do the same thing with his son, Rehoboam, by portraying virtue and wisdom and understanding and knowledge of God as a beautiful woman, and foolishness and sin and disobedience as a streetwalker, a harlot, a whore, the kind that you shouldn't want anything to do with. And yet, here the book of Proverbs, written by the wisest man who ever lived, given directly to his son blows it. He just blows it. First time out. And if a young man doesn't consider his latter end, then he's not going to listen to advice by his parents, older people, people that he should respect and regard. If you want to learn how to run a business or start your own company, then you learn from those who have done it before you and have succeeded. What's right, what's wrong, how it should be done properly, how it should not be done. And you can't duplicate it, but you follow their pattern if you want a similar measure of success. And same thing in life. Same thing if you want to learn how to stay married for 50, 60 years, you got to learn from people that have done it. Don't learn from some pop psychologist that's had 3 or 4 divorces of his own, and he's going to write a book on how to keep your wife happy. He couldn't keep 3 or 4 of them happy, let alone one. Verse 19 in our text today says, "A man of great wrath shall suffer punishment, for if thou deliver him, yet thou must do it again." A man of great wrath does suffer punishment, exactly as we use the word today. He really took a punishment for that in that last trial, that last testing he went through. He sure can take a beating when times are tough. You see some people, they make mistakes and they bring it upon themselves. And just when you think they're going to learn this time, they come back for more the next time. And when a man loses his temper, as a man of great wrath is prone to do, he's always punished in some way or another. Look, compare that with back at chapter 16, verse 32. Look back at chapter 16, verse 32, and compare what he said there. "He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. The temper, if ungoverned, will end up governing the man." Temperament is temper that has gotten too old to be spanked. A man who cannot control his temper cannot control his tongue, and that's true too. A guy loses his temper, he's going to blurt out whatever comes to mind and make things even worse. Some people act first, think later, and repent in the end. And an angry man who gets himself in a lot of hot water, no matter how many times you rescue him from his problem, he's going to get back in it. Because he doesn't seem to learn how to govern his own passions, his own temper, his own lust, his own desires, his impulses. They are not in control, or under control rather. And no matter how much trouble he gets in, you find he'll get into it again. It's always amazed me how often it's like these Lindsay Lohans, of the world. Doesn't matter how often a new mugshot is on the front of a magazine or something. No matter her or somebody else like her. To them, they just kind of use it as a new form of publicity. As long as people are talking about me some way, it's going to be good in the long run. And there's people out there that get paid to turn that into a good thing. But I would imagine her parents never wanted their kid to turn out that way. Or maybe they're losers too. But look at chapter 22. Chapter 22, and notice there verse 24. "Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man thou shalt not go." Look at chapter 29, and over there verse 22. Chapter 29, verse 22. "An angry man stirreth up strife, and a furious man aboundeth in transgression." Yes, they certainly do. Trouble seems to follow them. Disappointment, arguments, heartbreak, feeling cheated, feeling this. I have a man that I work with in my job during the week, and he's very impatient, man, very impulsive. He says, you think he'd be old enough to know better. He's about 65 years old, but he just blurts out what's on his mind, and he doesn't He doesn't control it. And one of these days, he's going to bring wrath down on the company if he doesn't watch what he says, to who he says it, and where he says it. Secretary asks him to take this deposit for the company, go to the bank and deposit. And the idea of having to go in and stand in line, with the ropes and actually give it to the business teller, he's just so impatient, and he starts an argument there in the bank and walks out. I mean, he's just trouble looking for a place to happen. And like I said, you'd think at that age he'd learn, but a guy dresses nice, looks nice on the job, and then just can't control what he says. He's going to say the wrong thing to the wrong family, the wrong people. In that business, tact and politeness are almost everything. I work in a funeral home, for goodness sake, for crying out loud. A guy doesn't know how to walk on eggshells and be careful what you say to people at a time of loss, or then you need to just toss him overboard. Let him go find a job somewhere else where they appreciate that kind of approach. They do or not. But verse 20 in our text again says, "Hear counsel and receive instruction, that thou mayest be wise in thy latter end." What you do in your younger years will influence your later years. This applies not only to sons and daughters, to people, but also can apply to societies and nations. A nation that starts out right, like this one did. Think of our Declaration of Independence in 1776, and the love of freedom. The Declaration of Independence starts off, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That's either the Declaration or the Constitution, I forget which. Actually, no, the Declaration starts off, "When in the course of human events," etc. But the belief of the founders in the preamble of the Constitution said those things. They believed that the rights of men ultimately come from God. The rights of people and the obligations of the governments they create one day are going to be answerable to a higher authority, to God. And they left it at that, because you didn't have atheism and agnosticism and evolution and all those things, communism to compete with. It wasn't even a factor. So it was sufficient to leave it at that. They had to get specific chapter and verse. But because they didn't, people think, well, God should be left out of it. They didn't have to go in that much detail. And everybody seemed to understand by instinct that the things I enjoy, the rights and the privileges I have, ultimately come from God. And one day I'm going to have to be accountable and give answer to Him. A nation that starts out right doesn't consider its latter end one day. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln called upon the nation to give thanks, and he says, "We have forgotten God." He told the whole nation, "We have forgotten God," in 1862. How much more do you think we've forgotten Him now? This is Sunday. All the political talk shows on TV on Sundays, not a single one of them cares what God thinks. Not a single one of them is interested in what God's interest in this nation might be, the future of this country. But I'm telling you, those countries, like this one, is going to end up on the scrap heap of history. Jesus said in Matthew 7, verse 27, you don't need to turn, He said, "The rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it." If the country of Malawi or Chad in Central Africa were to dissolve today, dwindle in just anarchy and chaos, who would notice? But if the United States were to collapse, it would affect every other nation in some way or another, because of the way we're interconnected with so much of the world. And to whom much is given, Jesus said, of the same shall much be required. This nation has received more, and it has more to be accountable for to God as a nation than any other nation. I don't know exactly how God plans to judge nations. I don't know if one day Christ will resurrect the leaders of those nations at critical times and ask them to give an account as to why they governed the way they did and receive judgment or punishment according. I don't know how he exactly plans to do it, but he does say he's going to. Christ is going to judge the nations of the world and separate them as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, one to the left, one to the right. So I'm not sure how he's going to do it. All we do know that's clearly laid out is righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And the wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. Psalm 9:17 tells us. So I'm not sure how he plans to do it, but that principle of considering your ladder in, considering what direction we're headed, if we're not careful, applies to nations and societies just like it ought to apply to an individual, a young person, young man or young woman. The latter end of world history is not going to be peace on earth through the United Nations. We're not going to, have climate perfection or solve global warming and all that nonsense that's not even happening. I don't believe in that stuff. When I was in 8th grade, we learned in science class what's called the conservation of energy principle. That is, if there is a decrease in trees somewhere, like in the Brazilian rainforest, remember they've been complaining for 25 years, they're chopping down too many trees too fast in Brazil, and it's just going to deplete the ozone and all this. If there is decrease in tree growth somewhere, there will be an increase in tree growth somewhere else. The world does this. The Earth, the planet regulates itself so that the overall temperature of the Earth remains constant. Remember in, it's got to be 15, 16, 18 years ago, McDonald's had this McDLT. Mm-hmm. Remember, it was like a styrofoam thing in 2 compartments. We'll keep the hot side hot and the cool side cool. And then they put a lid over it. You know what happened? The burger cooled down and the lettuce on this side got all wilty. Because once you put a lid on it, the overall temperature finds a medium between the hot and the cold, and it's just mush. But that product didn't last very long. They finally got rid of it. That's because the conservation of energy principle was at work even in that styrofoam container. And the Earth regulates its temperature all by itself with or without man's involvement. And so there's not going to be perfect harmony by the hands of man. There's not going to be perfect climate by the hands of man. There's not going to be peace on earth because of man's involvement, the United Nations pushing it. They might intend to redistribute everybody else's wealth and take it from those that made it and give it to those that didn't make it. There might be some universal belief in peace on earth and so forth, but it's not going to happen. It's going to happen according to the way God, and we'll get to that in the next verse, the way God has declared and dictated. A nation that's stupid enough to teach evolution by Darwin, or Darwinism. A nation that's stupid enough to teach, wild and tolerate wild superstitions like Catholicism. Remember those people praying to the water stain on the Chicago overpass 6 years ago, about 2005? Talk about ridiculous. There's some. This is the thing you don't understand. Why does the Virgin Mary always appear in some Mexican shower curtain? And then why does Univision and Telemundo want to go take video of it? Anybody that believes that in that nonsense, nobody says, no Jew ever says, I saw Moses appear on a pastrami sandwich. And I saw the picture of Moses or Abraham on my, rye bread. No, that doesn't happen. But any country that promotes that stuff and elevates that stuff and opens the doors wide for that sort of stuff is just going to get more of. Whatever you tolerate, you get more of. And any country that tolerates that kind of foolishness and promotes that stuff and reports on that stuff and elevates that stuff and heralds that stuff and celebrates that stuff shouldn't be surprised if God says, you're a bunch of pagans. I don't want anything to do with you. Any country that tolerates socialism, like by Ted Kennedy's or the Barack Obamas of this world, any country that believes in redistributing everybody else's wealth, or the perversion of the immorality of the Bill Clintons, the Jesse Jacksons, the Michael Jacksons, the Madonnas of this world, that country deserves what it gets one day when God judges it. Let's move on to verse 21, because it's really along the same lines. There are many devices in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the counsel of the Lord, that shall stand. There are many devices of scientists, of philosophers, politicians, of popes, psychiatrists, educators, ministers, and they may be cleverly expressed and cleverly explained to people and taught systematically, but in the end, the counsel of the Lord, that's going to stand. Jesus said in Matthew 24:35, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. You know something? You and I read out of a Bible that is 400 years old this year. 400 years old. You know how many people this Bible has outlived? You know how in 400 years, 4 centuries of time, a lot of generations can come and go. A lot of critics, a lot of atheists, a lot of antagonists, a lot of socialists, a lot of communists, a lot of Marxists, a lot of Catholics, a lot of Protestants, a lot of Jews, a lot of Muslims, and every other wacky. You know how many religions have probably started and stopped and came to a crashing halt during the lifetime of this book? This thing outlived the Heaven's Gate cult down in San Diego. This thing survived the Jim Jones cult in Guyana. This thing has outlived and survived so many other startup religions that look like something exciting. Armstrong is a member of the Worldwide Church of God, Herbert W. Armstrong. Everybody thought, well, this guy's got this worldwide following. Once he died, the religion pretty much fizzled out. It was all built around it. This thing's going to survive the end of TBN one day. I hope it comes soon. This thing's going to survive and be around after the end of Mormonism, after the end of the Jehovah's Witnesses. This book will still be around after the end of Catholicism, after the end of all the Protestant denominations that have corrupted the Word of God. The Word of God will survive no matter what other people think. And it's going to survive the counsels of the Lord, that shall stand. The counsel of the Lord, that shall stand. And there are many devices in a man's heart, what the verse said. Some universal belief among the world's religions that all roads lead to heaven, doesn't matter what you think, what you do. The counsel of the Lord one day is to destroy all the world's religions, to destroy all the world's politics, to destroy all the world's men's ambitions, their inventions, their intentions, their pursuits, their objectives. And what he's going to do is he's going to replace all of it with his own Son, seated upon the throne, governing the universe as it should have always been governed. That's the counsel of the Lord. That's going to stand. Everybody else's intentions to bring in peace on earth are going to flop and fail. But the counsel of the Lord, that shall stand. When Jesus said, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Bank on it. You can be absolutely certain of it. Verse 22. Actually, let's read. For time's sake, I'll tell you what. Let's read one verse, verse 22. The desire of a man is his kindness, and a poor man is better than a liar. The desire of a man is his kindness, and a poor man is better than a liar. That is what a man intended when he did a thing, is the real kindness in the act. The widow's intention when she gave her 2 mites into the temple's treasury in Luke chapter 21 was accepted by God and was much more valuable than all the big offerings given by the priests, the scribes, the wealthy men in the temple who boasted about how much they give, how often they fasted, and so on. That woman's heart was right. God can see inside. He sees the heart. He sees the motivation, the motive rather, the reason something is done in His name or not done. Is it either done? Has someone give a donation to the hospital because they want their name engraved on that plaque out front, or because they want to actually benefit the research or whatever is being done there? See, God sees the motive of the heart, and that's what He's getting at in this verse. We'll look at chapter 23 real quickly here. We're going to